saygılar sunuyorum. Bugün burada sizlerle birlikte olmaktan ayrıca mutluluk duyuyorum. Çünkü başında bulunduğum üniversitenin böyle bir toplantıya aracılık etmesi bizim için ayrıca bir mutluluk kaynağı. Onun için de burada çıkacak fikirlerden gerek benim ülkemin, gerek Ortadoğu ülkelerinin istifade etmesini umuyorum, temenni ediyorum. Bu sebeple de ayrıca size teşekkür ediyorum. Bugün burada yapılan bu toplantının, buna benzer toplantıların elbette ki her zaman yapılıyor, her zaman da yapılması lazım. Ama şimdi bir önceliği var. Bu önceliğin sebebi benim ülkemde şu anda anayasa çalışmaları var. Ayrıca Arap Baharı dediğimiz bir gelişmenin içerisindeyiz. Tabii bu Arap Baharı diyoruz da bir bahar mıdır, bir başka hadise midir? Onu da Türkiye Cumhuriyeti olarak, vatandaşlar olarak endişeyle takip ediyoruz. Çünkü Irak'taki son gelişmelerden sonra bahar deme şansını pek göremiyoruz. Endişemiz bunun için. Ümit ediyoruz ki bu endişelerimiz boşa çıkar. Hakikaten bu ülkelerde müsbet gelişmeler olur. Orta Doğu ülkeleri medeniyetin beşiği ülkeler. Sümerlerden beri birçok medeniyet bu ülkede kurulmuş. Hukukun ilk kaynaklarını da burada görüyoruz. Gerek Ur Krallığı'nı, gerek Hammurabi'nin ve gerek daha sonraki hukuk metinleri bu topraklar üzerinde. Daha sonra 3 tane büyük din bu topraklarda neşet etmiş ve onların medeniyeti ve hukuku da bu topraklarda gelişmiş. İslam hukukuyla da bu mesele zirveye ulaşmış. Dolayısıyla bu bölgede hukukun çok üstün bir birikimin olduğunu kabul etmek zorundayız. Kaldı ki daha sonra Bizans'la, Roma ile teması ve Avrupa hukukunu da ister istemez yakın ilgisi sebebiyle Orta Doğu ülkelerindeki hukukçuların hukukun büyük bir birikimi var, hazır bir birikimi var. Ama bu birikimi tatbikata çevirmenin problemleri var. Onlar tabii ki Irak'ta da, başka ülkelerde de, Türkiye'de de bunları yaşıyoruz, görüyoruz. Bizim ülkemizde anayasa çalışmaları 1808'de başlamış. Yani öyle kabul ediliyor. 1808'de başladığı kabul ediliyor. Gerçi bütün dünyada da bugünkü manada anayasa çalışmalarına bakarsak onlar da 1700'lü yılların sonunda başlayan bir çalışmadır. Ama üstün bir hukuk normu olarak bakarsanız ta başlangıçtan beri her zaman üstün bir hukuk normu fikri vardır. En azından insan vicdanında vardır. En azından adalet duygusunda vardır. En azından dinlerde dinin koyduğu kaideler vardır. Dolayısıyla üstün bir hukuk normu her zaman için vardır ama anayasa manasındaki çalışmalar, dediğim gibi 19. yüzyılda olan çalışmalar, Türkiye'de ondan pek geç kalmamış. Yani 1808'lerde Senedi İttifak'la bu işe başlamış. Senedi İttifak, o yıllarda Osmanlı İmparatorluğu fevkalade zayıf bir hale düşmüş. İç ve dış gayeleri artmış. Bunun üzerine içerideki asayiş bozukluğu üzerine eyaletlerdeki ayanlar İstanbul'da toplanmış padişah tarafından ve Senedi İttifak denen bir sözleşme yapılmış. Ayanlar devlete sadık kalacaklarına, asayişe bağlı kalacaklarına, padişaha itaat edeceklerine ve buna mukabil padişah da herkesin can ve mal güvenliğinden sorumlu olduğunu, hukuka bağlı kalacağını taahhüt etmiş. Bu çok geçerli bir sözleşme olmamış, pek tatbikatta da netice vermemiş ama bizim kaynaklarımız bunu Türklerin ilk anayasa çalışması olarak kabul ediliyor. Bugün hala böyle kabul ediliyor. 1839 yılında yine Padişah 2. Mahmud Abdülmecid zamanında 1839'da dış ve iç baskılar devam etmiş. Bir düzeltme olması niyetiyle ve biraz da dışarıdan gelen baskıları önlemek için 1839'da Tanzimat Fermanı diye bir ferman yayınlamış. Bu padişahın tek taraflı yayınladığı bir fermandır. Yani temeli bir fermandır. Bunda tabii görülür ki en çok azınlıkların hukuku gözetilmiş, azınlıkların dini hakları gözetilmiş, askerlik ve vergi mevzuunda yeni düzenlemeler yapılmış ve padişah kendisini hukukla bağlı görmüş. Söylediğim gibi bunun özelliği padişahın bizzat istemesidir. Yani dışarıdan bir dayatmayla değil, kendi istemesi üzerinedir. aynı padişah 1856'da yine aynı istikamette biraz daha geniş manada ıslahat fermanı diye bir ferman yayınlamış. Orada da ağırlık azınlıklardır. Mesela bir öncekisinde işte dini hürriyetlerini teminat altına alırken, askerlik hakkı verirken bu defa azınlıkların daha ziyade gayrimüslimlerin okul açma, kilise açma gibi haklarını da tanımış, eğitim haklarını da tanımış ve eşitliği sağlamış. Osmanlı İmparatorluğu'nda vatandaşlar arasında eşitliği sağlayan ilk belge diyebiliriz bu ıslahat fermanına. Ama dediğim gibi gayriler devam etmiş, sıkıntılar devam etmiş. 1876'da Abdülhamit, Padişah Abdülhamit döneminde etrafındaki bürokratların diyelim, vezirlerin de telkiniyle meşrutiyet ilan edilmiş ve bir anayasa yapılmış. 1876 Anayasası meşruti bir anayasadır. İlave bir hak, hukuk yoktur 1876 Anayasası'nda. Yani ıslahat ve tanzimat fermanındaki vatandaşlara verilen haklar devam etmiş. Ama daha ziyade devletin şekli, yönetimin şekli tanzim edilmiştir. Ve tabi bağlayıcı hukuki bir metindir. Fakat aynı padişah kısa bir müddet sonra meşrutiyeti lağvetmiş anayasadaki yetkisine istinaden ve anayasa gündemden kalkmıştır. 1908 yılında Osmanlı İmparatorluğu içindeki karışıklıklar devam etmiş. Bu defa aynı padişah biraz da etrafın baskısıyla ve isyanlar sebebiyle ikinci defa meşrutiyeti ilan etmiş. Aynı anayasadır. Yani 1876'da yapılan anayasa 1908'de tekrar yürürlüğe konmuş ve yeniden meclis kurulmuş. Çift meclistir. Hem ayam, senatör diyebileceğimiz ayam var hem de milletvekilleri var. Ayyanı yani senatörleri padişah direkt atar. Kendisi tayin eder. Tabii işte fesih yetkisi var. 1878'de 76'daki meclisle hemen feshetmiş zaten. Bu anayasamız 1921'e kadar devam etmiş. Bu anayasa kullanılmış ve meşruti bir rejim olarak devam etmiş. Ama 1921'de Birinci Cihan Harbi'nden sonra tabii ki imparatorluk parçalanmış. Elimizde kalan topraklarda Cumhuriyeti kurmuşuz. Cumhuriyeti kurunca 1921'de bir anayasa yapılmış. Bu anayasa meclis hükümetini esas alan bir anayasadır. Çok kısadır ama burada asıl dikkat edilen şey bütün yetkiler meclistedir. Hükümeti meclis atar, işte kanunlar meclistedir. Yani yönetim tamamen meclisin elindedir ve savaşı da bu meclis idare etmiştir. Yani o gün İstiklal Savaşı dediğimiz savaşı bu meclis idare etmiştir ve güçlü bir meclistir. 1924'te parlamenter sisteme geçilmiş, yeni bir anayasa yapılmış. O anayasada parlamenter sistem esasına göre 1961'e kadar devam etmiş. 7 defa değiştirilmiş o anayasa. Pardon, 5 defa değiştirilmiş o anayasa. 1961'de askeri bir hareket olmuş Türkiye'de. Ve bu sefer 1961 Anayasası gündeme gelmiş. 1961 Anayasası Türkiye'deki hukukçuların kabullerine göre iyi bir anayasadır. Yani hukuken gelişmiş bir anayasadır. Fakat bu anayasa kendi içinde 7 defa değişmiştir. Neden değişmiştir? Çünkü evvel emirde bu anayasayı o gün 1961'de darbe yapan silahlı kuvvetler de işlerine sindirememişler. Yani onların teşvikiyle, onların tazikiyle 7 defa değişiklik yapılmış. Ama bu anayasa çok tasvipte görmemiş. Neden tasvip görmemiş? Çünkü 1961 Anayasası bir önceki iktidarı ve onun kalabalık taraftarlarını tamamen dışlayarak hazırlanmış bir anayasadır. Yani onların görüşü alınmamış, fikirleri alınmamış. Onlar bu anayasaya hazırlanırken dışlanmışlardır. Onlar da bu anayasaya iyi veya kötü olmaksızın cephe almışlardır. İktidar da onlardır. Yani seçimle vatandaşın iktidara getirdiği gruplar da onlardır. Dolayısıyla 61 Anayasası 7 defa değiştirilmiş ve bu 7 değiştirme de hukuki istikametli olmamış, geri istikamette değişiklikler olmuştur. 1982'de tekrar bir askeri hak görüyoruz. Silahlı kuvvetler tekrar yönetime el koyuyor ve 1982 Anayasası yapıldı. Şu andaki anayasadır. 17 defa değiştirilmiştir. 80 küsur maddesi değişmiştir. İlaveler vardır. Şu anda yürürlükteki anayasa budur. 82 Anayasası farklı bir anayasadır. Darbenin, ihtilalin başkanı, Cumhurbaşkanı olacağı esasa göre tanzim edilmiş bir anayasadır. Ve Cumhurbaşkanı'nı çok güçlendiren, parlamenter sistemde Cumhurbaşkanı'na olağan dışı yetkiler veren bir anayasadır. Bugünkü anayasamıza göre Başbakan da çok güçlüdür. Meclis ve hükümet, Başbakan'ın iki duvar arasındadır. Hele siyasi partiler kanunlarına desteklenen bu anayasayla parlamento, Başbakan'ın iradesi dışına çıkma şansı yoktur. Şimdi bu sıkıntılar sebebiyle yeni bir anayasa çalışması söz konusu. 1900, Cumhuriyet'in kurulduğu günden beri Türkiye'de, daha önce de tabii silahlı kuvvetlerin etkisi var ama Cumhuriyet'le birlikte Türkiye'de silahlı kuvvetler çok etkili olmuştur. Bir gerçektir. Cumhuriyet'i bir noktada İstiklal Savaşı'nı yapan güç, Cumhuriyet'i kuran güç, zaman içinde bürokratlarla, yüksek hakimlerle, üniversitelerle ve büyük sermayeyle işbirliği yaparak bir elit grubu olarak Türkiye'yi idare etmiştir. Ve kendi istikametleri dışına ülkenin çıkmasına izin vermemişlerdir. Kendi koydukları kaideler vardır. Vatansever bir gruptur. Tabii ki öyle bir gruptur ama kendi koydukları kaideler vardır. Bu kaidelerin dışına çıkıldığında ülkenin felakete gideceğine dair inanç içindedirler. Dolayısıyla politik hayatı devamlı kontrol altına tutmuşlardır, tazik altına tutmuşlardır. 1950 yılından itibaren bu çember kırılmaya çalışılmıştır. Yani bu kırılmaya çalışılmışsa da işte yavaş yavaş kırılmıştır. Bugün de tam kırıldı mı, kırılmadı mı diyemeyiz. Niye diyemeyiz? Başka bir unsur var. Yani bazı şeyler olurken kendiliğinden olmuyor. Halkımızın silahlı kuvvetlere karşı büyük bir sevgi ve güveni vardır. Yani bugün de herhangi bir yerde bir general ile bir sivil yan yana geldiğinde halkımız generalin yanında toplanır. Yani öylesine bir askere karşı, silahlı kuvvetlere karşı sevgisi vardır. Son zamanlarda bu son iktidar döneminde bir hayli itibarlarında kayıp söz konusuysa da temelde böyle, altında böyle bir şey var. Tabii keza devlete karşı da saygı yüksektir. Dolayısıyla da bürokratlara karşı da farklı bir saygıları vardır. Yani devletin bekası Türk vatandaşı için de çok mühim bir unsurdur. Şimdi yeni bir anayasa çalışmasına başladık. Tabii bu anayasa çalışması ne getirecek, ne yapacak onu bilemiyoruz ama zor bir zamandır. Meclis Başkanımız büyük bir gayreti var. Daha önce anayasa hazırlayan, tamamen bir anayasa hazırlayan komisyonun başındaki bir profesör arkadaşımız da şimdi burada dinleyiciler arasında daha sonra konuşmaları da olacak. Değerli bir hukukçumuz ve profesörümüz. Onun da tabii yaptığı anayasa, onun başta olduğu komisyonun yaptığı anayasa zannediyorum ki önümüzdeki anayasa için bir esas olacaktır diye düşünüyorum. Olması muhtemeldir. Bugünkü anayasa çalışmalarında tabii hukuku bilmek yetmiyor. Yani bir hukukun toplumun önünü açması lazım. Ayrıca toplumla uyuşması lazım. Eğer bir hukuk toplumla uyuşmuyorsa bu hukukun iyi olup olmaması söz konusu değil, yürümesi söz konusu değil. Bir hukuk toplumun önünü kesiyorsa, kapatıyorsa ona iyi bir hukuk diyemeyiz. Çünkü iyi bir hukukun, iyi bir kanunun toplumun da önünü açması lazım. Anayasa için farklı bir hususlar daha var. Demokratik bir ortam olması lazım. Hoşgörü olması lazım. Ve hukukun üstünlüğü esasının toplumda da kabul görmüş olması lazım. Yani bir anayasa hazırlanırken daha farklı unsurların bu anayasada olması lazım. Şimdi siyasi partiler Türkiye'de diyelim anayasaya kim sipariş veriyor? Bir anayasaya sipariş veren var. Şu anda anayasayı Türkiye'deki bütün kesimler sipariş veriyor. Yani herkes yeni bir anayasa yapılsın diyor. Böyle bir talep var. Ama tabii ki herkesin beklentisi farklı. Talepler aynı, anayasa değişsin ama sonucunda herkes bu anayasa değişikliğinden farklı bir beklenti içerisinde ve işin zorluğu da burada başlıyor. Siyasi partiler diyelim ki bütün ideolojilerinden sıyrıldılar. İdeolojik hiçbir görüş olmadan anayasa hazırlanıyor ki anayasalarda ideolojik görüşlerin çok ağırlıklı olması da zaten normal bir hadise değil, sağlıklı bir şey değil. Ama mutlak ki temelinde bir istikamet olması gerekiyor. Şimdi bu anayasa diyelim ki ideolojilerden arındı. Peki bu anayasa kısa mı olacak, uzun mu olacak, katı mı olacak, yumuşak mı olacak? Bunları da geçtik. Bu anayasa parlamenter sistem esasına göre mi olacak, yarı başkanlığa mı göre olacak, başkanlık sistemine göre mi olacak? şu anda Türkiye'deki en büyük kavgalardan biri önümüzde bu anayasanın başkanlık sistemine göre olup olmaması için olduğunu göreceğiz. Yani önümüzdeki büyük sıkıntı bu. Tabii başkanlık sistemi ne getirir ne götürür de televizyonlarda filan görüşülüyor, görüşülmüyor değil ama hala ben dahi Türkiye'de başkanlık sisteminin tehlikeleri nelerdir, kontrol sistemleri nelerdir, onu tam olarak görmüş değiliz. Yani dünyada işte Amerika'nın dışında başkanlık sistemi başarılı değil diyoruz. Neden Amerika'da başarılı, neden başka yerlerde başarısız? Birçok sebebini bilmekle birlikte Türkiye şartlarında ne yapmamız lazım? Yani başkanlık sistemine geçmemiz halinde hangi kontrol sistemlerini getirmemiz lazım? Eyalet sistemine geçmeden başkanlık sistemi ne kadar etkili olur, faydalı olur, ne kadar kontrol sistemleri olabilir? Bütün bunlar şu anda konuşulan ve endişeyle takip edilen ama birçok insanın da heyecanla arzu ettiği bir münakaşa zemini yaratmış durumda. Türkiye inşallah bu çemberi yarıp çıkacaktır. Güzel bir anayasa yapmasını bekliyoruz. Biz Ortadoğu ülkelerinin de bu kadar hukuk birikimiyle, bu kadar medeniyet birikimiyle iyi bir anayasa yapacaklarına, yapacak birikime sahip olduklarına inanıyoruz. Ama söylediğim gibi onların da önlerinde siyasi iktidarlarla hukukçular arasında bir uyum sağlanması lazım. Ama ben diyorum ki tarihi bu kadar medeniyet geçirmiş bir toplum, hukuki başlangıcının olduğu bir toplum, bütün dinlerin içinden çıktığı bir toplum, niye dünyaya örnek olacak yeni anayasalar, yeni hukuki düşünceler meydana getirmesin? Kaldı ki bütün hukuk sistemlerini çok yakından görüyoruz. Bütün kaynaklar elimizde, mukayese yapma imkanlarımız da var. Bu itibarla ümit ediyorum ki gerek Türkiye, gerek komşu ülkeler bu dönemi sağlıklı anayasalarla geçirirler diye düşünüyorum, inanıyorum. Ve sizler zahmet edip buralara kadar geldiniz. İnşallah ülkemizden mutlu ayrılırsınız. Sizi ağırlamak şansına sahip oluruz. Ve bu toplantının gerek bizim ülkemiz için, gerek komşu ülkeler için hayırlı neticeler vermesini temenni ediyor. Hepinize tekrar teşekkür ediyor. Saygılar sunuyorum efendim.
I would like to thank Mr. Sungur for this wonderful overview of both Turkey and of the history of both Turkey and the Middle East. I think it was a very clarifying opening speech. We won't make coffee break if it's not a problem for you. We're going to immediately start the first session. And our first session is titled Social, Economic and Cultural Context of Democratic and Constitutional Transitions in the Middle East. I believe that we do not need to single out any of our speakers because they are also distinguished, and I believe that we should start as soon as possible. So, chair is yours, sir.
No coffee break, we go.
We're ready to start.
I understand we are missing one of the speakers assigned.
No, he's there.
Oh, ISAWI is here. Okay, all right.
He just wanted to be more comfortable then.
All right. Okay then. So that first, I welcome everybody on behalf of Şehir University and our fledgling law school. This is a new university, and we have a new fledgling law school. We are all excited about it. This is one of the first major activities, and we look forward to it. I would like to introduce, although he is indeed very well known, Professor Michael HUDSON, but first let me about the organization. We didn't have time to talk about it. If the speakers talk about 20, 25 minutes, at most 25 minutes, then we'll have enough time for discussions. And it's important to deal with, to incorporate, to include the audience. So in that sense, I beg the speakers to really try to stay within the limits, keep their talk within the limits of this 25 minutes. Okay. But now the speakers, Professor Michael HUDSON is the director of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore since 2010. Of course, previously He was the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, professor of international relations, and Seif Kobash, professor of Arab Studies in the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where he is, of course, also a professor emeritus. I'm sure you all know that he has made immensely important contributions to the field in such areas as Arab uprisings, Lebanese politics, US Middle East policy, Gulf security, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the information revolution in the Arab world. He has held many prestigious fellowships, including Guggenheim, Ford, and Fulbright. And he was the former president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America. Please welcome me to introduce Michael Hudson.
Maybe I can speak up.
Yeah, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to Shahar University and to participate in this most interesting conference. I am a political scientist, and I would like to talk a little bit about how my discipline, the discipline of political science, has tried to understand the question of the Arab uprisings. So you will perhaps excuse me if my approach is a little bit parochial in terms of the parameters that were laid out for this conference. For example, with respect to the question of constitutions and constitutionalism, as a political scientist who has studied the Middle East, up until recently, I have felt almost no need to refer to constitutions or constitutionalism because, broadly speaking, the regimes of the modern, the contemporary Arab world, even though many of them have constitutions, have operated in essentially an extra-constitutional fashion. And that is one of the reasons that I have argued for quite a long time that many of these political systems have what we might call a legitimacy deficit, because rule of law, constitutions, constraints on officials have been, largely speaking, quite lacking. So I don't have a lot to say about constitutions except to observe that I think in the future, as we now look to the unfolding process of the Arab uprisings, and we have only seen just the beginning of it, I believe, I think that the question of constitution making, constitutional reform, reforms to institute a meaningful rule of law in the new political systems that are emerging will be much more important than was the case in the past. With respect to the title of this session, I will also, with your permission, not have a lot to say about the social and economic conditions which may have contributed to this remarkable wave of popular protest that we have seen and will continue to see operating across the Arab world. I am aware, of course, that there are very interesting arguments being made, research being done on the question of social inequalities and economic distress that may have provided underlying causes for this unprecedented popular protest that we have seen erupting throughout the region. But as a political scientist, I want to really confine my remarks to politics and to the political process. And that may explain why I must say that political scientists, by and large, were as surprised as everybody else when these uprisings began to break out a little more than a year ago. My paper begins with a question of why political scientists, along with many other analysts, were surprised. My colleague Gregory Gause has summarized, I think, some of the most important reasons for this. He found that the Middle East studies community, mostly political scientists, had turned their attention narrowly toward explaining why the authoritarian systems are so durable. That led to a focus on the large, well-funded military security apparatus so pervasive across the Arab world and its apparently tight relationship with the regime leadership. And we tended to speak in political science shorthand of the Mukhabarat state, the national security state, whose stability was pinned down mainly by fear rather than by a respect for constitutions or law and order. But no less important was the state domination of the economy, not just in the classic pure oil rentier manner, but also in the way that at a time of the renaissance of neoclassical market-driven economic theory, Arab regimes were still able to infiltrate and dominate the emerging private sector. So concentration on these two conditions diverted scholarly attention from the negative political effects of what we used to call the Washington Consensus, which were not observed so clearly. And hardly anybody saw what Professor Gause describes as a new cross-border pan-Arabism. And that gets, of course, to the whole question of new information technologies and what we like to call the Al Jazeera effect. So, we have to collectively issue a kind of mea culpa for having not done such a good job of understanding what was about to happen. Now, having said that, it is also true that there were analysts and even a few political scientists who did more or less see what was coming. But I think the journalists actually did a better job in sensing that something was about to explode than were the academics. And in my paper, I quote a number of prominent American journalists and British journalists who were telling us that despite the apparent enduring durability of these authoritarian systems, something was about to happen. And in particular, a very good journalist, David Ottaway, lately of the Washington Post, in the winter of 2010, not long before the first uprisings broke out, wrote a very interesting article which concluded, and I'll just quote him, he said, "However, this prevailing model of Arab autocracy dependent on the Mukhabarat and a fabricated popular vote does not seem a recipe for lasting political stability. Indeed, the Arab political cauldron contains all the ingredients for explosions in the years ahead." So, and there were even a few political scientists who intimated, without being able to say, without being able to predict that these things are going to happen in January of 2011, but who nevertheless were quite apprehensive. I can mention two or three. One, a Tunisian political scientist, Larbi Sadiki, who long before the Arab Spring broke out, wrote analyzing the Ben Ali regime as being essentially hollow and much more prone to breaking down than I think most people had thought. And there were a number of others who suspected that all was not well, and that the focus of mainstream Middle East political science simply on the mechanisms how authoritarian regimes maintain their power were missing the larger context. Another part of my paper discusses the history within the discipline of how authoritarianism and democracy are understood across the Middle East. And basically, I argue that there is a kind of a cyclical pattern liberal modernization theorists in the 1960s were optimistic that modernization would bring about democratization. It didn't really happen. And then there was a counter-reaction with more conservatively oriented political scientists saying, no, we have to bring the state back in, we have to look at questions of authority and tradition and so forth. And then after a while, there's another oscillation in this pattern, and in the late 1980s, I was among these people were beginning to write, wait, civil society is emerging, NGOs are proliferating everywhere. Certain regimes, we think of at the time of Algeria, Jordan, Yemen, Kuwait, seemed to be opening up. But that too seemed to have been short-lived, and then the wheel turns around again, and we have what was, until about a year ago, the prevailing doctrine that the authoritarian states of the Middle East are pretty much here to stay and don't expect much else. Well, we're all, therefore, I think we need to approach this important topic with a certain humility in light of our past failings to understand what's really going on. If I have a moment or two, let me just digress into what I call the definitional conundrum of the Arab uprisings. What exactly are we talking about? And without trying to be overly pedantic, I think we have a lot of work to do in defining and operationalizing our dependent variable, the Arab Spring, as it is called. That's not my favorite locution, or whatever one chooses to call it. I'm not comfortable with the term Arab Spring, nor was our, I think, previous speaker, but it is interesting to see how widely this term has come into common usage, including in the Arab world itself, where Arabi al-Arabi seems to have taken hold as the way to talk about this. But we need to fix the temporal and spatial boundaries of this phenomenon, and we need to establish the kind of connectivity, if any, between the uprisings and potential uprisings. Did the Arab Spring begin on December 17th, 2010 in Tunisia, or on June 6th, 2010 with the murderer of Khalid Said? Or is it part of a process, as my colleague at Georgetown, Samar Shahata, has suggested, referring mainly to Egypt, that starts with the labor protests there in Egypt in the year 2000 through 2004, or the second Palestinian Intifada of 2000-2002, followed by protests over the US invasion of Iraq, the emergence of the Kifaya movement, and Egypt's growing economic difficulties in 2004, the democratizing pressures from the George W. Bush administration, 2003 to 2005, the Gaza war protests of 2008, 2009, the so-called farcical elections in Egypt of November 2010, and the church bombing in Alexandria on January 1st, 2011, all of this before the January 25th official beginning of the Arab Spring in Egypt. And then if you look to others, the sociologist, the well-known sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein, sees what he calls the spirit of 1968 flowing through the Arab Spring. And for him, the world revolution of 1968, some of you will remember the student protests in France, the various kinds of protests in the United States at that time. He sees all of this as part of a pattern going back a long way. And therefore the Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States are just the latest manifestations. So whatever one may think of this particular alleged lineage, I think it's a bit of a stretch myself, he is not the only scholar to view the Arab Spring as a long-term historical phenomenon whose end is not yet in sight. And what of the spatial dimension? Is this spring essentially Arab, Or does it transcend the geographic region from Morocco to the Gulf that we conventionally call the Arab world? Nearly a year or more into the uprisings, observers are now attributing an influence from these uprisings in the Arab world to places of protest far afield, like Israel, China, Iran, France, Britain, and the United States. Is the discourse of protest Arab-specific, or does it touch on apparently universal values of liberalism, democracy, participation, and human security, rule of law, constitutionalism? What are the essential features of the Arab Spring, and how can we operationalize them? Quantitative analysis of networks and connections between the protesters from Tunisia to Yemen to Syria and other Arab countries in which overt protest has yet to occur. Content analysis, perhaps, of the discourse of the uprisings, tracking of the Al Jazeera effect, Facebook and Twitter, following the money trail of material support for these sustained protests, investigating the direct role of foreign powers, studying the psychology of aging leaders too long in power, and of the younger generation apparently leading these uprisings. So, finally, searching for conclusions. So, confronted with the genuine surprise of the Arab Spring, the post-democracy theorists of persistent authoritarianism need to search outside their paradigm for answers. And as I've suggested, what goes around comes around. As we examine the analyses of those who got it right, it seems clear that we have to broaden our focus, but hopefully going beyond a simple return to old modernization and civil society theories. Clearly, many of the economists and political scientists who were sensitive to the oncoming upheavals were evoking familiar social and economic factors. Journalists who appear to have been more successful than academics relied on their subjective feel for the situation, rather like how a weather-beaten coastal New England resident can smell a storm coming. But beyond instinct, in the best of cases, was a wealth of empirical observation on the part of these journalists. So perhaps the social science disciplines should draw a lesson here. Acultural theoretical abstractions certainly have their value, but if they are emphasized at the expense of down and dirty fieldwork, combined with deep knowledge of specific regional conditions, they may be setting themselves up for more surprises of the kind we have recently observed. Studies with a regional focus that have been widely denigrated in American academic circles, at least as mere area studies, in today's volatile climate should be given more respect. So what might we conclude from all this? To recapitulate, most explanations for the Arab Spring are country-specific, but what if the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and the Arab Spring is actually, in part at least, a transnational phenomenon? Have we underestimated the spillover effects from one uprising to another? Middle East political scientists became overly attentive, I believe, to explaining why authoritarianism persists and neglected exploring factors that might challenge that persistence. And a too easy acceptance of the rentier state theory might have lulled analysts into a false sense of security over the immunity of rent-driven systems to sustain protest. But in Bahrain, protests continue to this very day, despite the regime's ferocious attempts to suppress it with a little outside help from Saudi Arabia. Elsewhere in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, actual protest episodes, as in Oman and eastern Saudi Arabia, along with uncharacteristically robust demonstrations in Kuwait, and the anticipation of such protest in the future, has led, according to a recent report from the Gulf Research Center Foundation, to billions of dollars of benefits from the governments of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain, money that would not have otherwise been spent in such a manner. This rentierism on steroids, as you might put it, will provide an interesting test of the theory in the months ahead. So scholars of contemporary Middle East politics seem to have oscillated between liberal optimistic and conservative pessimistic, or they would say realistic, paradigmatic poles. The latest turn of the wheel has dismissed what my colleague Morten Valbjørn in Denmark called the democracy spotters in favor of a realistic post-democracy focus on why authoritarianism persists. Now, if the Arab Spring has now led us to a reconsideration of the possibilities for greater popular participation, who is to say that if the protests lead only to a new kind of authoritarianism, the wheel won't turn again? The Arab surprise suggests that there are three promising areas for new scholarly thinking. One is social movements and the dynamics of societal networks. The useful work done 2 decades ago on civil society in the region needs to be further elaborated. The concept of civil society in the Middle East itself needs unpacking. What does civil actually encompass? How do we understand apparently uncivil tendencies? And we're seeing some of that as we speak in places like Syria. What do we do about tribes and youth, to note 2 factors that figure in the present debate over where the Arab Spring is headed? Previously, it was a step forward to count NGOs, the number of NGOs, and present aggregate measures of media exposure and the like. Now, we need ways to measure and evaluate the impact of the new information technologies and social media. When a well-informed observer asserts that the Arab Spring would never have happened without Al Jazeera, how can we ascertain the validity of such a statement? The Wild Ronames and other influential Twitterers have thousands of followers, but how do we calculate their influence in shaping a new and multi-dimensional public opinion? And now that opinion polling has become widespread, how much do the polls themselves influence opinion? A second area for rethinking is state and regime. While, as I was arguing, they have been overstudied lately, we are still generally operating within a European Weberian framework that stresses control capabilities and bureaucratic structures. From that perspective, it is easy to focus on mukhabarats and state domination of the economy, but it is less helpful in encouraging us to investigate key inter-elite relations, such as the connection between the military security apparatus and regime leadership, or the ways in which regime leadership learns, or equally likely fails to learn, to cope with a changing societal and international environment. Surely there should be more work in the neglected field of leadership, and here there might be no better guide, I must say, than Shakespeare, whose portrayal of leaders gone astray, like Macbeth and Richard III, might provide psychological insights relevant to certain Arab rulers, whom I will not name. And then there's the tricky question of the moral weight of the state. Yemen is widely regarded as a failed or failing state, but we understand less about the idea of Yemen for Yemenis as a state of mind or myth which possesses meaning and value and whose leaders accordingly are deserving of a certain respect under its moral umbrella. Regimes may fail if they are seen to betray the state in this sense, but the state, however feeble it may be in Weberian terms, lives on. And then finally, the third object of renewed attention is the nature of external involvement. Here, of course, there is an older body of work upon which to draw. I think of Leonard Binder's essay on the Middle East as a subordinate international system, Karl Brown's book on Middle East international politics, in which he depicted this region as an everlastingly penetrated zone over which the penetrators could never quite achieve lasting hegemony. And as I note earlier in the paper, some US neoconservatives credit the Arab Spring to the exhortations of, unlikely as it seems, of President George W. Bush and his promise of US support for democratic protest. And so on. The external environment clearly needs careful attention, particularly as we now observe the unfolding tragedy in Syria. This brings us to what, in my opinion, still remains the central issue: political legitimacy. It is true up to a point, as Adam Prozorski and others have pointed out, that regimes can be quite stable without enjoying legitimacy, up to a point at least. Moreover, legitimacy is a challenge to operationalize. A reading of the first year of the Arab uprisings suggests to me that they are all about the perceived illegitimacy of rulers and regimes. So perhaps, in conclusion, it should be, as we say, back to the drawing board for students of legitimacy in the Arab world, especially political scientists. Thank you very much.
We thank Professor Hudson very much for this immensely illuminating presentation. And now I turn to Professor Clement Moore Henry, whose book, The Mediterranean Dead Crescent, is a very influential work in the field. He is the chair of the Political Science Department at the American University in Cairo, and he works himself on issues of globalization, banking systems in Islamic Mediterranean countries, and the development of civil societies in general in the Arab world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the university and especially Professor ERGUN AZBUDUN, an old friend and colleague of mine from many years ago, for this opportunity to address you. You've just heard from Mike, I think, a very stimulating paper about the failures of political science and some of the challenges ahead for understanding this Arab Spring, uprisings, whatever we want to call it. Now, I came here today sort of to speak about the topic social, cultural, and economic conditions of democratization in the Arab world. But in effect, I want to narrow that to looking at some of the economic conditions that underlie civil society and to try to sort of quickly in broad strokes distinguish between the different kinds of theoretically perennial regimes that are in process of change, collapse, challenge, and whatnot. Because I think that the underlying sort of socioeconomic conditions are not sort of the same for each situation. These are all variables, you know, old modernization theory, social mobilization theory, that do not sort of, one size does not fit all. It's very much a matter of context. Facebook in one place is not the same as Facebook in another place. So my units of analysis are the 20-odd regimes that I could study in the Middle East and North Africa. And with Bob Springborg, we did a second edition of a book on globalization and the politics of development in the region, which included Turkey and Iran. And we used a typology that turns out, I think, to be quite interesting in terms of what has happened since early 2011. What was our typology? Well, we looked at first the military regimes we call bunker Janissary republics, because they have very few channels of intermediation between regimes and people. The channels are all basically personal, tribal, ascriptive networks. I'm thinking the examples would be Algeria, would be Syria, Libya under Gaddafi, Libya being the almost poster card case of a bunker regime, because there were no intermediaries, because intermediaries Gaddafi wished to destroy in the name of having direct democracy, which in fact degenerated, as we know, into thugocracy, where the regime was behind bunkers, basically, in the end, killing people. But these regimes, by contrast with others that may or may not have a military base to them, but where you have substantially more intermediation, more civil society, and this gets us to the question that Mike raised of counting. How do you know a strong civil society from a weak one, given that they're all relatively weak in the region? Is it just by counting associations, NGOs? Well, what I've tried to do in this paper that I'm not going to read to you is I take two traditions of civil society. One is the more familiar one of Tocqueville, the art of association in the America of the 1830s, where associations provided, you know, kind of a protection against what was really a potentially very tyrannical majority of, you know, very self-satisfied, self-righteous, Puritan people who could be very nasty to one another. And so the art of association was necessary to protect them from what we could call sort of America's version of fundamentalism, which is chronic to American society. So anyway, the Tocqueville conception of civil society on the one hand, but then there's another school, which is simply that of, you know, Karl Marx, civil society as being basically the society of self-interested economic actors who, incidentally, even in Hegel's philosophy of right, he even put the police in civil society. It's society without the legitimacy of the state, but just pure, raw self-interest. The sort of society that Marx, of course, called bourgeois society, which had to be destroyed. Well, I look at bourgeois society and I look at Tocqueville, and I ask myself, in the context of the Middle East and North Africa, how these two might relate. And I'm on, you know, kind of shaky ground here, but what I'm trying to argue is that if you have a private sector, however apparently dependent it may be on state actors, if it's large enough, then that is also a basis on which associations can live. You know, NGOs need financing. I've, you know, heard many stories as I've done research over the years. I remember particularly in the 1970s and 80s when Tunisian liberals were trying to mount oppositions to a Bourguibian state gone crazy. And the problem always was, well, you get a newspaper, but then you can't finance the newspaper because the people who might want to finance it are afraid because the regime will slap them down. Ahmed Mastiri was in this situation in the 1980s, and there are other cases. Well, anyway, all of this led me to believe that, okay, even if there's repression, if you have a relatively substantial private sector, this in turn may help to feed this art of association. And I found, looking at my data, that, you know, when you go through the republics, the bunkers had extremely weak, marginal private sectors, which I could measure simply by going to the banks, looking through IMF statistics, looking at a simple measure of credit to the private sector, and looking at that as in absolute terms and in relative terms. And that was a way of quite effectively distinguishing my bunkers from my bully states, which were also military, also authoritarian, but which, as I say, tolerated much more of a private sector, where you had more of a play, an ostensible play of politics, than in the bunkers, and where you had more developed bureaucracies, Tunisia and Egypt being my illustrations of countries which started out their state building in modern bureaucracies back in the 19th century, and which persisted and really today have more developed state infrastructures, along perhaps with Morocco, than any other state in the Middle East, because they all have a history, and they have a legitimacy, not necessarily of the regime, but of the entity, the national entity. I add Morocco because Morocco has a dynasty dating back to the 17th century and previous dynasties. And, you know, the space has been variable, but basically a certain part of Morocco was always under sort of a continuous rulership, and quite different from the Arab East, where we're talking of relatively modern constructions. At any rate, these stronger states having more bureaucracies, also having more intermediaries, and it follows also for Morocco, having stronger civil societies as measured by private sector activity, bank credit. Another way of looking at these regimes is to ask yourself, how much money is kept at the bank rather than under the mattress or in the heel of your shoe? The cash economies usually reflecting an immense distrust of these modern Western intrusions known as conventional banks. And again, these are numbers that you can sort of pull out online by going to the IMF financial statistics. You find a certain line which is money outside the deposit banking system, and you have the total money supply, and you can figure out the proportion of money that is actually in the banking system. By these measures also, it turns out, you know, that there are quite sharp distinctions between the bunkers, which reflect societies in which people distrust these public institutions known as banks and prefer to keep the money in their shoes or under their mattresses, and countries that have more developed public institutions, namely Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco too, for that matter. So one could then see that what happened, obviously nobody could predict, you know, the fall of Ben Ali when it happened, or the fall of Mubarak. And although at the time I saw, as Tunisia was falling, I also saw, you know, I didn't think this could even spread to Egypt, despite their similarity. But then, you know, my typology, in fact, did hold up, and Egypt was indeed the next to respond. And then as you sort of burrow more deeply into it, you discover, of course, that this was not just a sudden phenomenon where Egypt, gosh, they saw Ben Ali fall, and so they jumped into Tahrir Square. The movement of January 25th was already pre-planned before the fall of Ben Ali. Police Day was to be celebrated, and it was one of a series of events that Mike Hudson has already alluded to that happened in Egypt. So this kind of event you couldn't predict, but you can, after the fact, sort of look at the structures and see that the underlying structures were actually more favorable in Tunisia and in Egypt than they were in the other countries. Also, to extend to the monarchies, they would be more favorable in monarchies that have a relatively strong private sector. But there are other considerations here. Morocco being, again, the perfect illustration of a monarchy which was able, indeed, to generate intermediaries. When Hassan, well, even when Muhammad V, after independence from 1956, to prevent the emergence of a single-party system, he certainly it permitted natural social pluralism to express itself politically. And you've had ever since an extremely complex game in Morocco, which then does reflect a relatively strong, healthy civil society. You know, I'm not saying that these organizations are not subject to tremendous manipulation, but they do offer a political space. And so Morocco, you know, when the king saw what was happening in Tunisia, it was, you know, a fairly simple matter to pull out the book of political, what shall I say, the manual for guiding the Moroccan political system. Recall that your father had brought in a leader of opposition back in 1995 and given him all the miserable government responsibilities of the economy while keeping the essentials to yourself. And the king, his son, did pretty much the same thing again, March 20th, responding to the February 20th demonstrations. So monarchies in general have tended to be more flexible simply because they can play off the intermediaries. But now, I guess I'm running out of time. The further comparisons between Tunisia and Egypt, which were the only ones actually to engage in what appear to be really major transitions underway, I could go on to show how actually in Tunisia the civil society was indeed a bit more structured, a bit more developed, and the Islamists, as one Egyptian said, about 2 generations ahead of their Egyptian counterparts, which is all leading to an extremely, I mean, the underlying conditions are there now for an extremely promising prospect of a transition to democracy. But let me just counter that with one final observation coming from Egypt. Revolution, Hannah Arendt once suggested, is a move back to some origins. The Egyptians seem willy-nilly, I mean, the thing has been terribly organized and everybody has been, you know, accusing SCAF, the military authority, of making all sorts of mistakes. But they are bumbling their way back into what, in effect, was a kind of a quasi-democratic system back from 1923 to 1952, when you had a constitution, you had 3 centers of power, the constitution not always being obeyed exactly, but 3 centers of power nevertheless giving a political game. You had the king, you had the Waft Party in Parliament, and you had the British High Commission. And it seems to me today in Egypt we may just be moving back to a system, instead of a king, we'll have a president, instead of the Waft, we'll have a Muslim Brotherhood parliament, and instead of the British High Commission, well, I think the SCAF, the army, is going to be with us for a while, a problem that, fortunately, Tunisia does not face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Henry. Our third speaker is Professor MURAT ÇİZAKÇA. He's an old friend and dear colleague, so I personally am delighted to be introducing him and welcoming him to Şehir University. He is a professor of Islamic finance and comparative economic history at the Global University of Islamic Finance at Kuala Lumpur. He has taught in various universities, including Boğaziçi University, Koç, but also Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He has been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin, and of course his contributions to economic history in Turkey are immensely important, as well as economic history of the Ottoman Empire, I should say, and also comparative economic history. But he also has a gem of a book about why we need democracy in Turkey. So I welcome MURAT ÇİZAKÇA with delight.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for this introduction. Again, it's absolutely a great pleasure to see you after so many years. In Ankara, we have been at Boğaziçi University in the 70s.
Yes, yes.
Back in the 70s, and you have changed slightly. Of course, I haven't changed at all.
I grew a beard, you cut yours.
Yeah, my beard is gone because it turned white. That's why. Well, okay. I have to admit I'm not as Engin already explained, I'm not an expert on constitutional law, but I'm a comparative economic historian. And as such, I have been interested in cross-cultural borrowing of institutions. And my concern is how to design a constitution as well as an economic system that would combine the best of the West and the basic teachings of Islam. So that has been my concern. I am obsessed about making a synthesis. I try, but whether I succeed or not, we don't know. And my co-author is Dr. Al-ABDULAZIZ Al-ISAWI. He's sitting over there, and he is an economist, and also he has been a politician, a former minister of economics and trade in Libya. We have met in Kuala Lumpur for the first time, and we discussed our thoughts, and this paper came as a result. We agree on most of the points, but disagree on some points as well, and he will have the opportunity to explain why he disagrees, why he agrees, and what we can do about these problems. Anyway, this paper, my paper, is based upon the assumption that within the next years, it may be a heroic assumption, but it is based on the assumption that within the next years, 5 years, bulk of the Islamic world will, inshallah, get rid of their dictators and be governed again, inshallah, by democratic regimes. If so, what kind of a state and what kind of an economic system will these countries have? Now that democracy is advancing, the future political and economic systems of Islamic countries will be decided, hopefully, by the peoples themselves. What then will be this system like? I will argue that these systems should fulfill 4 conditions. First, it should be compatible with the basic teachings of Islam, with the Sharia. B, it should embody the most important achievements of the West and the Islamic civilization. Third, or C, it should be desired by the people themselves. And finally, it should be able to achieve sustained economic growth. But sustained economic growth can only be achieved if certain preconditions are fulfilled. So, preconditions for economic growth. What are the preconditions for economic growth? Now, all economic systems, Islamic included, need to fulfill certain preconditions in order to achieve economic growth. In Western societies, these conditions are well known and taken for granted, but not in dictatorships. So we need to note their importance. The Western societies have identified and then fulfilled these preconditions after centuries of warfare. In the last major war that they fought, in the Second World War alone, about 50 million people lost their lives. Therefore, these values that they have developed in the West are priceless, are absolutely important. That's why we need to have a synthesis. The Sharia, this is what I will concentrate on. Is it possible to combine, somehow to put together the Sharia together with the values of the West, which are priceless, both priceless? Now, the first value, of course, is the rule of law, which was already mentioned by previous speakers. In a nutshell, rule of law means that everybody is equal before the law. This principle found application for the first time in the early modern West in the year 1688, when the King and Queen of England, I'm talking about not the idea itself, but the institutionalization of the idea. In 1688, when the King and Queen of England visited the Parliament and declared solemnly and in humility that they shall obey the laws of the Parliament like everybody else. Now, economic historians have discussed for quite some time, debated for quite some time, the impact of this event known as the Glorious Revolution on economic development, more specifically on the Industrial Revolution, whether the Glorious Revolution led to the Industrial Revolution. This has been debated. Most recently, a young economic historian, Dan Bogart, was able to quantify this, and he was able to show that thanks to the Glorious Revolution and the property rights that it introduced, massive investment took place in England on transport sector, which triggered the Industrial Revolution. So we have here a causation, finally. We have here rule of law, providing property rights, leading to massive investment, which led to the Industrial Revolution. Now, so the rule of law is essential for effective property rights, without which no economic system can function. If you don't have property rights, the dictator can come and take it from you. Or if you don't have rule of law, the dictator can come and take all your work from you. So, rule of law, property rights, without which you cannot have economic development. Now, effective property rights, the Arabic word for it is hufz al-mal. It is one of the 5 components of maqasid al-shariat. So it is right there. It is in the Islamic culture. It is considered to be one of the 5 original purposes of the Sharia. So the rule of law, a Western institution, becomes a precondition for one of the purposes of the Sharia. The concept can be expanded so as to grant complete equality before the law to all citizens, with total disregard to religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, what have you. This expansion will be compatible with another purpose of the Sharia, that is the hufz al-nafs, protection of the individual. So these strong Western values, which emerged out of centuries, are perfectly compatible with the basic teachings of Islam. Now, what about democracy itself? Now, recent research has shown that, I'm referring to Allmark's research here, he has shown that democracies do not fight wars. In a democracy, you do not have famine. In a democracy, you do not have a government killing its own people. No massacres. And then, on top of all that, 7 out of 10 richest countries in the world are democracies. The remaining 3 are small oil exporting emirates, so they do not really count. But democracy is not just elections. It needs to operate as a package. The government is divided into the legislative and executive branches, as you all know, and the third branch is absolutely important, the judiciary, but the judiciary, as the Turkish experience has demonstrated very clearly, the judiciary must be objective and must be unbound by any ideology. It is this independent judiciary which fulfills the rule of law and protects property rights. Each of these branches controls the others, which leads to the concept of checks and balances. In view of the importance and the support that it provides to the original purposes of the Sharia, I have suggested, not only me, but other scholars also in the Islamic world have suggested that democracy should be added as the 6th purpose of the Maqasid al-Sharia. I can refer here Kamali, Professors Kamali and Auda specifically. Another very important concept, of course, is freedoms, particularly the freedom of thought and worship. These are absolutely important for economic development. Although associated usually with the Western world, these freedoms are absolutely important for the Islamic world as well. The former, that is the freedom of thought, ensures that the Islamic concept of hisbah becomes applicable. You cannot have hisbah unless you have freedom of thought. And the other one, the freedom of worship, ensures that sectarian violence is avoided. Both absolute necessities for economic growth. Modern reinterpreters consider these freedoms to be embodied in the Maqasid al-Sharia as well. More specifically, freedom of thought is considered to be embodied in hifz al-aql, protection of the mind, and freedom of worship, that is a hifz al-din. So all these Western freedoms are also embodied, and they are perfectly compatible with the basic teachings of Islam. Freedom of worship is so important that I need to say a few words about that. I have called it secularism originally, but then I have crossed it, and I have called it avoidance of sectarian violence. This I did in response to the comment of my co-author, Dr. AL-ISAWI. Secularism is disliked in the Islamic world. It is because it's considered as a Western influence. It is very complicated. We can discuss that maybe in the future, later on. But in order to understand its importance, maybe we need to look at the history of the West. You see, after fighting long wars and centuries of bloodshed, Western nations learned to avoid sectarian violence through secularism. The last major religious war, I think, if I'm not wrong, was the 30 Years' War, which ended in the year 1648. The West has developed basically 2 types of secularism, the French and the Anglo-Saxon. The French is totally irrelevant for Muslims, as it is basically anti-religious in nature. How it emerged in France can be discussed. It's not HUDSON one is more neutral, but still irrelevant, as it not only separates church and the state, but also declares the state to be without any religion, with total disrespect in a way for religion. Both types have been condemned in the Islamic world by Professor Said Naqib al-Attas, an outstanding Malaysian philosopher. So I would argue that still another type of secularism is needed. One in the Islamic world. I think we need another type of secularism, one not only effectively separating state and religion, but also respecting religions. The S at the end is very important. Separation of state and religions is needed in the Islamic world just as much as it was in the West for basically two reasons. First, if such a separation does not exist and the state declares itself Islamic, whoever is governing the state can claim that he is governing in the name of Islam and places himself above criticism. History is full of examples, not only history, but today too, is full of examples of absolutist tyrants governing in the name of Islam. Second, if the state is Islamic, this immediately invites the question of which Islam? A Sunnite state discriminates against the Shiites and vice versa. In short, sectarian violence and dictatorships ruling in the name of Islam can only be avoided if the state distances itself from religion and at the same time respects it. Now, origins of the concept of separation of the state and religion can be traced back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. When he migrated to Medina, he signed contracts with the non-Muslims there, and even with the pagans. So it is a right. The document that he signed is known as the first constitution in the world. We can discuss that. You may disagree with that term, but whatever. It's known like that. The first constitution, or the Medina constitution. In that document, there are the roots of secularism in Islam. So it is the Sunnah of the Prophet. Such a system was also applied by the Abbasid Empire, and we see it in a more developed form in the Ottoman Empire. The establishment of the office of Shaykh al-Islam. This was the highest religious office, but the Shaykh al-Islam, this is important, the Shaykh al-Islam was never a member of the cabinet of ministers, Divan-ı-Umayyan. He was not a member of the Divan-ı-Umayyan. So this means that there was a de facto separation of the state and religion. It was an institution for consultation. More importantly, the Ottoman state granted all non-Muslim groups complete freedom of worship and was able to govern for centuries highly diverse peoples of a huge empire by and large without sectarian violence. The system succeeded so well that throughout the 14th, 15th, and the 16th centuries, countless crusaders' armies aiming to dislodge the Ottomans from Europe with the help of the Christian Ottoman peasantry failed. The Christian peasantry neither revolted nor changed sides, and the invading crusaders, without the support of the indigenous population, were easy prey for the Ottoman armies. A major reason for the loyalty of the Christian peasantry in the Balkans was the religious freedom that they enjoyed. The Ottoman state failed, however, to extend the same tolerance to the Muslims and discriminated, occasionally even massacred the Shiites. This was a huge mistake, because the result was endless sectarian violence among the Muslims, not between Muslims and non-Muslims, but between Muslims. When Iran began to support the Ottoman Shiites, the conflict quickly worsened, and Ottoman-Iranian wars, which lasted for more than a century, started. These wars proved to be disastrous for the whole of the Islamic world, because while the two great Islamic states were thus engaged in mortal combat, Christians entered the Indian Ocean and conquered it with relative ease. It is for this reason that Muslims need some form of secularism just as much as the Westerners. To sum up, we would like to argue that a modernized and improved version of Ottoman secularism granting complete freedom of worship to all the citizens, including all the Muslim groups, and at the same time effectively separating state and religion will bring an end to sectarian violence. This is a very important precondition for economic development. Capital accumulation, sustained and assuming that these conditions are fulfilled, let us talk about now economic growth. Sustained and rapid capital accumulation is in the newly emerging democratic nations of the Islamic world will follow the fulfillment of the preconditions I have just stated. Let us assume that they have been fulfilled and look at the process itself, the enrichment, the economic growth itself. First of all, trade and profits constitute the essence of capital accumulation. In Islam, there is no upper limit imposed on profits. The only condition imposed is the knowledge that we shall all be asked in the day of judgment how we have earned and how we have spent our money. These are the questions that a Muslim businessman is going to be asked in the day of judgment. If he is a believer, he believes in these things. So the message is crystal clear. As long as profits are earned legitimately, halal, and they are spent on the needs of our family and for the good of the society, a Muslim businessman does not need to fear his wealth. This is in sharp contrast to Christianity, where Jesus Christ, ﷺ, he said, he urged Christians to abandon their wealth and to follow him. There's a sharp contrast. For a Muslim, as long as what he has earned is halal, and he spends it for his family and for the good of the society, there is no upper limit to profit. You can earn 1,000% profit, no problem. So, moreover, earning profits are considered to be good because it makes it possible for a Muslim to fulfill his pilgrimage duty. Without profits, how can you finance your pilgrimage? So, capital accumulation and religious duties become inseparable in Islam. Capital accumulation in an environment of strict interest prohibition, on the other hand, now here we come to the problem, can only take place by transferring the capital of the principal to the agent, utilizing Islamic business partnerships. This concerns Islamic finance, a highly sophisticated field, which I cannot, of course, discuss here due to time limitation. Capital, okay, now that we have discussed very briefly capital accumulation, what about capital redistribution? Every society first accumulates capital and then redistributes it. Okay, first we look into, I might say that basically we have three institutions: taxes, the law of inheritance, and waqfs. You can accumulate endless capital, but you redistribute it through taxes, inheritance, and waqfs. The tax policy is quite very interesting. If you look at the Quran, there are only 3 taxes mentioned. And 2 of them cannot be applied anymore. Only one of them, the zakat, is still applicable. And based upon this, some Islamic economists have argued that we have to find ways to introduce non-Quranic taxes. They are missing the point, in my opinion, because the Quran is giving a subtle message, and the message should be clear. Assuming balanced budget, modest revenue to be collected by the Quranic taxes, 2.5%, so low, means modest expenditure leading to a small state. As it is well known, small state is the most desired form of governance today. Viewed from this perspective, the modernity of the Quran is simply astounding. But the real is not taxes, but waqfs. So it is, the redistribution is based upon voluntary redistribution through the waqf system. Okay. This is tantamount to establishing a third sector, that is the non-profit sector. The evidence that Muslims have actually practiced, we have evidence that Muslims have actually practiced this principle, can be found in the Ottoman budgets of the 16th century, when the Ottoman Empire was at its zenith. Ottoman budget studies have indicated that bulk of the state revenues were channeled to the military. So small taxation, modest taxation, whatever you collect, you provide it for defense, and all the other major services, education, health, municipal services, roads, caravanserais, whatever, all the infrastructure was provided by the waqf system through voluntary donations. So I would say that modern democratic nations of the Islamic world, assuming they wish to follow the Islamic tradition, should impose minimum taxation upon the population and let the essential services be financed through the waqf system. One warning though, particularly for our colleagues coming from North Africa. Much of North Africa has been colonized by France, obviously, but France was the most hostile country to the waqfs. So they have destroyed it there. So the starting point must therefore be a completely new waqf law, which not only is in perfect harmony with the Sharia, but also takes into consideration the latest developments in Western philanthropy. This Western philanthropy is relevant for us. Indeed, let us remember in this context that some of the greatest universities in the West were actually established emulating the medieval Islamic waqf madrasas, Oxford, Cambridge, and what have you. We can discuss that. Now, successful institutions are borrowed across civilizations. So just as the West borrowed medieval Islamic waqf madrasas and universities, there is definitive evidence about Oxford being borrowed from the Islamic world, established as a waqf university. Modern Muslims can and should borrow the latest advances achieved in Western philanthropy. Monetary policy. How on earth can you conduct a monetary policy with zero rate of interest? Open market operations, controlling inflation in an economy through open market operations of the central banks becomes a huge problem. Okay, my time is out. All I will say is that we need hybrid instruments combining profit and loss sharing with fixed returns, which we have developed. I'm happy to say at INSAFE in Kuala Lumpur, we are in the process of modernizing the Ottoman ESHAM into a modern instrument for open market operations of central banks. So I'm at the conclusion. We are building up our knowledge about the political and economic systems which the newly democratic nations of the Islamic world should pursue. These systems embody the combined wisdom and experience of the West as well as our own heritage. The former should be incorporated only insofar as they conform to the basic principles of the Sharia and address the needs of modern Muslims. It is to be hoped that the resulting synthesis will be a highly effective one and will lead to the development of modern Islamic capitalism, which can compete with that of the West and stand tall on its own. Such a system will not only be a great achievement for Muslims and alleviate their poverty, but will also be a gift to the whole humanity. Thank you.
I understand we'll continue along these lines with Dr. Ali Al-ISAWI. Dr. Abdulaziz Al-ISAWI is, as already mentioned, is a Libyan native and a Benghazi native in Libya. He has an economics degree, but served as a PhD in economics, but served also as a diplomat, and I understand he has also been involved in important projects in both Malaysia and also certainly in Libya when he was the Minister of Trade, Investment and Economy from 2007 to 2009. Yes, he was also the ambassador of Libya to India, but he took an honorable, dignified stand against what was going on in Libya in February 2011 and joined the Libyan Transitional Council. But again, perhaps he has taken another honorable stand, and once the liberation from Gaddafi regime happened, he withdrew from politics and is more involved in helping the transitional activities in Libyan society by contributing to civil society organizations and also creating an awareness of various transitional issues in the Libyan society and within Libyan institutions at large.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Sahara University for inviting me to be with you today. Thank you to give me this opportunity to talk to you today. I would like to add to my colleague's speech regarding Arab Spring and reorganizing the state. First of all, I would like to say that we didn't reach the Arab Spring yet. We have passed this Ottoman season. And now we are in the winter season. The previous season where the trees, the leaves of the trees falls, we have seen the dictatorship falling, and now we are in the winter season, where there's a lot of problems, anarchy, stagnation, and a lot of issues we should take care of to build and to reorganize the future state. After this season, we can see the spring. So, in order to reach the spring, where the flowers blossom, we have to take care of this season, and we have to do our duty during this critical period. Professor Murat talked about the prerequisites for reorganizing the state and in order to have economic growth later on. This is a very important issue. And these points raised by Professor Murat, and I agree about most of these points. The rule of law, it's very important to have a very good system respecting the rule of law, protecting the rights, mainly the property and economic rights for the people, so they can be active and participate efficiently in the economic cycle of the country. Without that, we cannot achieve the desired economic growth. There might be some economic growth, but it's not that reflect the desire of the country or the people. Freedoms, the correlation between freedoms and economic growth is very significant. And there is some econometric studies prove that. And for my country especially, we have tested that. Most of the economic failure we had was because of the lack of economic freedom of the people. obstacles facing the private sector to grow and to act efficiently in the economy, which was made artificially by the regime itself, has caused the low standards of living for the Libyans. So, for a country that has oil wealth, this is not the real situation that it should be. The per capita income for the Libyans is equal to the per capita income for the Lebanese, a country which has no resources and has no oil revenues. And other countries who has more freedom, more economic freedom, has double and treble than the per capita for the Libyans. This is related also to another point raised by Professor MURAT, which is the democratic package. Democratic package is connected to the freedoms. It's included. Freedoms included in the democratic package. So it's very important, if you want to have economic growth in the future, we have to fulfill the prerequisites and establish the base for that desired economic growth. The point of sectarian violence, we have never experienced sectarian violence in our country, and it's not relevant to my country especially. And the separation between religious and the state and secularism also is a matter of debate. And we have made poll opinion in the country between the University of Benghazi and University of Oxford that showed that people would like to see a great role for religious in the country. But the question is how? How this role could be played in the country. This should be an issue of great discussion in the country so we can receive the feedback from the people. And after that we can construct a very good system, include all the desires of the people. Regarding the capital accumulation and the economic system, we have a great heritage and we can benefit from that. And I have seen regarding the financial crisis happened last years that Islamic bankers had not suffered a lot. And contrary to that, some of them are getting more profits while the others suffering and going bankrupt. We have to go and to do our duty and to find the reasons behind that. And how can we reflect this in our new constitutions, in our structures, new structures of the countries, of the Arab countries, which are now experiencing a great change and historic change. Again, I say that we have to do our homework and to organize these prerequisites for the future of the country. the most important thing that you can see these changes, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, we are neighborhood countries. So these structures might be, in a way or another, might be in a harmony with each other. One of the great problems, the cooperation and the integration between neighborhood countries, and mainly the Arab countries, is the differences in the economic and political systems. While now we are going to put our systems, the harmony is very important for the future of economic cooperation. In order to have a very good economic cooperation and integration, there should be no big differences between the systems. And this will help too much to gather the resources, to gather the efforts, and to help the different countries to get very, very high growth rate. It's time to do all of these things if we want to benefit from such big sacrifice we have made. Social and economic indicators is very important. And I remember before the starting of the Libyan revolution, and before that, someone might ask, why Libya came after Egypt and not after Tunisia? If the Libyan revolution came after Tunisia and before Egypt, might not succeed. Any change in Libya, any effort in Libya cannot succeed while the two countries on the left and the right, the two systems still there. Ben Ali regime and Mubarak regime. So you can see that the Libya started immediately after secured the two borders where we could get supplies and the help from the others through the borders. Without that, we cannot succeed. I remember before the Libyan revolution, someone sent me an email, he works in the cabinet, he's a friend of mine, asking me about the reports, international reports about Libya. I replied him, I sent him to my office, told him, go to the shelf and you'll find complete study about all the reports, international reports about Libya, and go directly to the conclusion and to the implications and go do it. Don't waste your time. But that was a few days before the revolution. But in my opinion, I think it's too late. It's too late to make any reforms or to fulfill any recommendations, which has been many years on the shelf. At that time, there was an article in The Economist, if I remember, they call it the Revolution Indicator. They collect all the reports, economic freedom reports, and transparency reports, and the corruption reports, and so on. So they mix them together, and they extract an indicator, and they can forecast which country next shall have a revolution like what happened in Tunisia and Egypt. And they made the sequence and they ranked the countries. Libya was number 1. And it was Yemen, Syria, all these countries were listed in that article. So that's why I replied to him and I said, it's too late. I think it's time to change, and these artificial and not serious reforms we have experienced will not work. I can say that we will have a tsunami in Libya, and it will be changed in a violent way against the wish of the people. And it happened. So now it's time to work and do our homework regarding the future of the country. And this paper, with me and Professor Murad, I can say it's a draft paper, it's not a final paper. And we had 2 sessions before Professor Murad. We had 2 sessions in Malaysia, and we had another meeting here in Turkey, in Istanbul, and we shall have further meetings together to improve such paper. Thank you very much.
We thank Dr. Ali Al-ISAWI. Now it's time for questions. I will have to take advantage of my sort of chairmanship to ask the first questions. Indeed, it is important that to recognize that political scientists fail to predict things, and we should seriously reflect on why they keep doing this. It's not only the Arab Spring or what's happening in the Arab countries today. They also failed to predict the fall of the Soviet Union, not to mention a number of other major failures. So if it is a science, what are they really doing? I mean, they have to be very serious about this matter. I have in my mind, indeed, that here the questioning of the discipline has to go to its aims. What do they aim to do? Is prediction an aim? Should they perhaps take up other issues? What can another approach be? I have my own ideas, but I'm keeping them to myself. Really, I mean, we are training political science students here. What should we tell them? I mean, how should we reconfigure so the political science department in Şehir University to do something better than our prominent the prominent leaders in this field appear to have failed to do. It's not a matter of prediction, but then what should it be? And the other thing, of course, in Professor Henry's very really enlightening presentation, I paid attention that he's drawing his models from Western European experience and sort of working with some kind of a synthesizing of two models based both on Western European experience. Does Western European experience exhaust human experience? Shouldn't we try to build models that would make an effort to incorporate other experiences? And that connects me to, of course, Professor ÇİZAKÇA's and Dr. Ali-ISAWI's paper. It is a very exciting paper. In a sense, it is trying to do what I've just suggested, that you have to turn to the experience of other peoples, other parts of the world, people who live in other parts of the world, with different kinds of sensibilities, with different kinds of historical trajectories, and then take advantage of that experience to recast certain issues, for instance, like two models of secularism based on Western experience is not enough. Can there be a third model of secularism? But so, I mean, there is this dialogue, so to speak, or this discussion between different presentations. I want to underline that. But at the same time, the model they are trying to build struck me as really being very much liberal European inspired. They're using Islamic concepts to justify a liberal European concept model. I'm not against that. I'm not against that because deep in my heart, I'm a very committed liberal myself, more of the Enlightenment type than positivist type. So I appreciate what they're doing, but at the same time, let us not be kidding ourselves. This is a very liberal model they're developing. And let me, in that context, point to the tension between democracy, the concept of democracy they're using, and the concept of rule of law they're using. Rule of law does not necessarily guarantee you democracy. And rule of law, if it meant in the, say, Glorious Revolution and the European experience, equality before the law, it is really the equality of the proprietors before the law. It doesn't include those who were not proprietors. Whereas in the Islamic concept, mal, as indeed one of the maqsad, one of the several maqasid of Sharia, Islamic legal tradition, both in theory, in good theory, I mean, there are different, of course, theoreticians in this context, and also in the Ottoman practice, means not really property as property, but the security to guarantee, to have a means to one's basic livelihood, to have the basic means of livelihood, subsistence. In that sense, that's how it works. The concept works in Shatibi, North African, I mean, prominent scholar, in Mawardi, Egyptian scholar. I mean, that's how the concept is really, what the concept really is. And also in the Ottoman practice, I demonstrated this in my articles, that means not property as property, but the right to have the basic means of livelihood. Now, if you guarantee that to everybody, can you have capital accumulation, you tell me? You can't, historically speaking. And that's where the tension emerged in the modern era as far as the Ottoman legal system is concerned. And of course, it's a legal system based on the Sharia precipitation. So what do we do about these kinds of things? Democracy comes later on, and it is in the European context, and how it comes. Yes, rule of law, democracy, all these are important, but yes, we should know their history in the European context, perhaps a little bit more effectively, and we should also know the Islamic sort of tradition, which is multifarious, really. It is multifaceted. How do we bring the two to come up with certain models that indeed, as Murat was, my dear colleague ÇİZAKÇA was emphasizing, that we could come up with principles that will resonate in the societies in which these constitutional efforts, new economic models are being discussed. But maybe I should take a few more questions and then I'll give the floor to, yes. You should introduce yourself, of course.
However, I have one question. You mentioned that the new regimes in very small amount of tax, focusing on security and the rest of the provisions being provided by private donors or private institutions. Now, this has been practiced in the West, at least over the last 30 years to a certain extent. And we can't really say that in terms of democracy, it has produced the best of the West. In fact, it has, one could argue that it caused a corrosive effect on the democracy. When you took the state out, which is interested in the public interest, in the public, and you put the private in its place, and dealing with provision of welfare, it seems to create, and then you actually make the state focus on security. The net result, looking at the United States today, or the United Kingdom, has been the state not actually diminishing, but growing as a security state, as a police state, dealing or being preoccupied primarily not with the public, but as a matter of relations with the wealthy, powerful private donors. And that has actually, when we take the state out, it hasn't really made the polities more democratic. It has made them less democratic. As a result, we have all these protests in the West at the moment, and a sense of injustice, social injustice. What makes, do you agree with this, first of all? I mean, I don't want to change your framework and present it as something else. But what makes you think it's something of a neoliberal or libertarian Islamic model? What makes you think it's going to work in a democratic way in the Middle East today, if it hasn't in the West? Thank you.
Bir soru daha alalım. It's working? Try this one.
ZAID from International IDEA. I have two questions, if you permit me. One is to Dr. Ali. I was wondering if you could just say, not a question, but a request, if you could say something about the current state of the debate on decentralization, federalism, centralism in Libya. If you could give us a quick, insofar as the chairman will allow you, a quick overview of what the current state of the debate is today, which I think is one of the more pressing issues, at least insofar as outsiders are concerned in Libya. And the other would be to Professor MURAT. I also share the concerns of the previous questioner. I mean, you mentioned the 2.5%, and you said there was a subtle message from the Quran that what's needed is a small state, and then you glossed over that issue by saying that there's consensus. You didn't use that term. You said that today the modern state, the modern view, is that a small state is what's best. I mean, in my view, there's no consensus about that. There's a huge amount of debate going on about that. Even if we were to consider that a small state is what's best, I mean, what you're proposing is far smaller than anything that exists. 2.5% is really nothing. I mean, I don't see how any state can function just on the basis of that. I mean, in Iraq, in my country, I mean, if we were to rely only on that and not rely on oil income, which is far, is 95% of our income, we would all starve to death. I don't see how the state can function with just that. And surely, I'm asking, are you actually proposing that the state should only be financed on 2.5% income tax, or are you considering also other sources of income, Yamada, Yuan, and so on and so forth? I'm not sure what else it is that you have in mind in your framework.
Maybe it's time we give the floor back to the speakers.
So, all right. Well, I'll try to respond very briefly to the chairman's blistering attack on my discipline. As one who rarely reads the American Political Science Review, I'm torn between defending the profession and agreeing with the critique. But very, very briefly, I think political science as a discipline has many purposes, and one of the original purposes has nothing really to do with prediction at all. It has more to do with prescription, and going back surely to Plato and Aristotle and through a long history of Western political thought, the contributions of the discipline have been more, I think, in the area of moral philosophy. What is right rule? What is the proper role for rulers and leaders, and so on and so on. I think in modern times, the discipline has several purposes. Part of it has been simply descriptive and institutional, to give students an understanding of constitutions, laws, principles, and so forth. In the starting probably in the 1930s, and certainly into the 1950s and 60s, there was something called the behavioral revolution in political science, in which a new generation, thinking that indeed there are possibilities for scientific precision in this discipline to be discovered and developed, led, I think, to some quite interesting findings. And there have been a number of quantitative exercises that have, shown, I think, with some compelling evidence. For example, the negative relationship between oil wealth and democracy, which is not predicting anything in particular, but it is providing a certain kind of understanding. So I think understanding is perhaps a stronger suit for the discipline than actual prediction. Having said that, I think that if you were to, ask me to advise how to structure your new department, dealing with things like the Arab uprisings, I would say that, again, focus is everything. Within the discipline these days, as political scientists here will know, there are sort of doctrinal, almost ideological arguments between rational choice theorists and sort of cultural, anthropological approaches to understanding complex social realities. I think I tend to lean to the latter of those schools, even though once upon a time I did quite a lot of quantitative research. But I think possibly there is a consensus that there are too many variables, reality is too complex, contingency is everything, and that it is no easy matter to do prediction, and you probably should be leaning more toward understanding, trying to promote understanding than to say, along with the intelligence services of the world and the policy think tanks, exactly when the next revolution or coup might occur. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think political science is not so much prediction as developing judgment. The Kantian third critique, neither understanding nor ethics, but that in-between thing. And this, so anyway, the cultivating of judgment through understanding. However, that said, with the Arab Spring, as I sit in Cairo chairing the Department of Political Science, we are going to be engaged in a program in electoral studies, and we're going to try to be networking with other countries which now, for the first time in a very long time, if ever, are engaged in meaningful elections and have meaningful parliamentary activities, have the sorts of things, in short, that American political science has been pioneering since the behavioral revolution. The behavioral revolution, one can say, is now sort of 4 decades behind coming to the Arab Spring, with all the polls, the surveys, as well as elections that become available for empirical political research.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for these comments. I start with Professor Akar's comments. And of course, you are right, Engin. You said rule of law doesn't guarantee democracy. Absolutely. Yes. But I didn't say that. It guarantees property rights, I said. And property rights, of course, as you said, it's for the proprietors. So the Glorious Revolution was for the proprietors. Yes, I would agree with that also. But you see, without proprietors, you could not have had Industrial Revolution. That is the point I was trying to make. That is the contribution, latest contribution, quantitative contribution by Dan Bogart. He was able to demonstrate that, I cannot give you the exact numbers now, but the 15 years, as far as the investment in the canals, construction of the canals, which is the basic, the essence of the Industrial Revolution, transport sector, he compared the total investment in the canal construction in England after the Glorious Revolution. So in the 15 years after the Glorious Revolution, the total amount of investment made in the canal construction was equal to the 85 years previous to the Glorious Revolution. So this is quite a concrete evidence about the importance of property rights. If you have rule of law, property rights, this leads to capital accumulation and even to Industrial Revolution. It may not be the definitive end to the debate, but it is quite a persuasive one, I should say. Without proprietors, what would you have? Without proprietors, you would have some sort of a socialism, I presume. So I can also ask, I was asked if capitalism has worked. So I can also respond and say, has socialism worked? And look at the situation of the socialism. The most important socialist regimes of the 20th century have abandoned those regimes. So where are we? Again, returning to Engin Akarlı's idea of subsistence, the rights of all to basic existence. But then he also asked, can you have growth? These are very difficult questions. I remember a recent research made by my friend and colleague, one of the greatest Ottoman economic historians, Mehmet Genç, who happens to be teaching at this university. His office is in the 4th floor. Now, he made a very interesting study of comparative begging. He was able to demonstrate that by looking at the so-called dilenci defterleri in the Ottoman archives, the documents on begging, he was able to count the number of beggars in Istanbul, and then based upon Gerenek's work, the Polish historian, he was able to compare this figure with the number of beggars in Paris at the same time, more or less. And he reached the conclusion that the number of beggars was 10 times bigger in Paris than in Istanbul. This is despite the fact that Istanbul was a much larger city. So, in other words, to respond to Engin Akarlı's point, the Ottomans did manage to alleviate poverty. I suppose we could reach that conclusion. We have quantitative evidence. And this will be very appropriate from an Islamic perspective as well, because in the Quran there is a verse which talks about ummatan wasatan, which means the Quran informs us that we have been created as a society of the middle. So this is an Islamic concept as well. Now, so the huge question is, how can we have what I call Islamic capitalism? Now, a lot of people dislike that term, but I insist on that term. There is something called an Islamic capitalism. That is ethical capitalism. The dislike that we all have, myself included, for the term capitalism refers to Western capitalism. I'm not referring to that. I am referring to another type of capitalism which preceded Western capitalism by almost a millennium. What they borrowed, and the Westerners borrowed some of the most important institutions of their capitalism from Islam. So the huge question is, How can you have, it appears to be like contradictory, but it is not. On the one hand, we have this concept, Quranic concept, ummatan wasatan, and on the other hand, I'm talking about Islamic capitalism. And I'm sure you are getting the impression that I'm contradicting myself. I am not. I assure you I am not. Because you can have capitalism, an ethical Islamic capitalism, and at the same time have equitable distribution of labor. You are right. This cannot be done with zakat of 2.5% taxation. You are very right there. But it can be done through the Waqf system to start with. You need to understand the origins of the Waqf system. What a powerful hadith there is behind it. So for any believer, any Muslim, establishing a waqf is a very, very serious matter. Anyone who is afraid of the day of judgment, establishing a waqf becomes the institution. It is also the sunnah of the Prophet, as I said. Moreover, there is something else. The entire Islamic finance, the whole issue of Islamic finance. Now, Islamic finance is a modern sector of about, at the moment, it is the total assets governed by Islamic financial institutions is about $1 trillion at the moment. And it is growing about 15 to 20% a year. Now, that is supposed to be based upon profit and loss sharing. So the profits that are, I'm talking about profit and loss sharing, partnerships between the capitalist and the agent and the entrepreneur. Once you have that, it is not working like that at the moment, unfortunately. We are working day and night on it. We are criticizing, we are screaming that you people are doing it wrong. I'm referring to the Islamic banks. They are in the wrong way. But it is possible to combine, to do profit and loss sharing as the Prophet had done with through Mudaraba partnership. The Islamic banks are not applying that particular method. But if they do, if we eliminate the obstacles that they are having, of course, I could not have discussed this in a conference focusing on constitution. These are details of Islamic finance. All I'm trying to say is that once you solve those problems, then you can have an ethical capitalism which also provides for ummatan wasatan, more or less a medium society. This is not only my opinion. The original point was made by, again, my colleague and friend, by Professor Sabri Orman. So I entirely am in agreement with him. These are totally new concepts. These are actually ancient concepts, 1,500-year-old concepts, but we are just in the process of rediscovering them and remodernizing them. Thank you.
I will give the word to Henry. Professor Henry wants to add something.
Well, I find this discussion fascinating, and you were going to talk a little bit about partnerships, and I'm thinking of the work of one of your compatriots who now teaches at the University of Southern California, Timur Kuran, who has written several books very critical of the Islamic tradition, but arguing that the basic problem had to do with just this issue of partnerships, of corporations, which would organize, capital and produce economic development. What do you think of his analysis?
I published my critique. I published 3 articles criticizing Timur Kuran. Originally, I was in agreement with him. You see, we have a long past. It started with my book, Comparative Evolution of Business Partnerships, published in 1996 by Brill. And in that particular book, I made the observation that there were no corporations in the Islamic world. I reached that conclusion by studying the Ottoman financial records in the Ottoman archives. And I did not find any corporation. So he started from that. He tried to explain why there were no corporations in the Islamic world. And then he reached the conclusion that the culprit was the Sharia. And to that I objected. We are having a continuous debate with him. To To that I objected, and I said that what caused the absence of corporations in Islam was not the rigidity of Sharia, as he claims, but rather what I have called Ottoman quasi-socialism. Ottomans had a system which I call, I may be wrong, again many people don't like my terms, but I have called it proto-quasi-socialism. Again, my colleague and friend Mehmet Genç calls it with a different name, and he has developed another model. But take his model and take my model, we are talking about the same thing. It is like two blind men touching the elephant. I am touching at the tail, he is touching at the trunk. And we are all like that, we are all in that position. But the conclusion is that it was a quasi-socialist system. Of course, how can you have a socialist system centuries before Karl Marx? This is the main criticism that I get. Well, when I reflected this to Mehmet Genç, now he's from, he's a good lass, and so he has enormous sense of humor. He said, well, human beings have had their stomachs for millions of years, but now we are calling it stomach. so what he was trying to say is that you can have a particular political economic system which has been called socialist by Karl Marx, but it doesn't mean that it didn't exist before that. So for centuries it has existed. And I think this is about it.
Dr. Ali, do you want to make any contributions, please?
Thank you very much. I was stick to the subject and I didn't talk about Libya and Afghanistan. But I'm sure that many are curious to know what's going on now. Now we are in the transitional period where we are heading to elections in next July. These elections will give us the National Congress, because the National Congress, this National Congress will form the assembly to draft the Constitution, which is very important. And also to nominate, this Congress will nominate a new government. And after that will be a law for general elections. They will draft a law for general elections, which will be about 1 year after this Congress and this government. So now it's time for elections in next July, and the other July will be another elections. Then we will have elected government and the parliament. Now in Libya, everything is debatable. You can debate everything. You can see a lot of new newspapers, TV channels, radio stations. People are talking about federalism, to go back to the same system we had in the early days of Libya when it was independent in 1951. We had a federal system. This system formed a country with 3 parts: western part, eastern part, and southern part. And it was eliminated in 1963. So, in the beginning it was the United Kingdom. The name of the country is the United Kingdom. After that, in 1963, it was the Libyan Kingdom. So it was a period, transitional period. We had a federal system in the early days. Now some people talking about the same system we had in the early 50s. But according to the bulk opinion I talked about, which has been done by Benghazi University, argument has no support. There is some minority is supporting this argument for some reason, different reasons. Now this is the situation in general. Of course, we suffer from financial and economic crisis. All the sectors suffering and production is stopped. And we resumed the oil production now, going in a very good way, restoring the same levels of production. But other sectors, other industries still suffer. And one of the problems is the manpower. We know a lot of labor forces coming from abroad. Some countries are still stopping their people from going to Libya for security reasons, and for logistics also. So there is economic and financial crisis. Also, there is a security issue where the weapons have been mass distributed in the country. Everyone has his own weapon. And it's a great effort to collect back these weapons. But the only important thing now, the most important thing, is to have elections on time, where the people can see the legitimacy. They can see elected people, because the NTC was not elected. And it was the members of NTC chosen by wide consultancy according to circumstances and situation was in this crisis and this revolution. But after elections, things will go fast because those people can make the right decisions because they are elected. Now everybody is reluctant to make hard decisions on it. They have no full legitimacy. Thank you.
All right, we have about 4 more minutes. If you have, we have 4 more minutes. If there are other questions, yes, please.
Nadia Bernoussi from Konu. J'ai appris beaucoup de choses ce matin. Je n'ai pas de questions particulières à poser, mais peut-être une ou deux remarques. La première remarque, c'est que le printemps arabe s'est focalisé sur la notion de justice, la notion de bonne gouvernance, la détermination de notre régime politique, de nouvel ordre. Mais on s'est rendu compte aussi que le printemps arabe, c'était des révoltes sécularisées. Il n'y avait pratiquement jamais de référence à la religion. Alors, si vous voulez, on se retrouve devant une situation où la révolution était sécularisée, mais après on a eu des élections islamisées. Et là, c'est la différence entre le peuple quand il est révolutionnaire et le peuple quand il envoie des représentants au Parlement. Et ceci n'est pas typique ni au monde arabe ni au monde musulman, puisqu'on a des références notamment en France, où après la Commune de Paris, les Français ont envoyé une assemblée monarchiste. Et on se rappelle aussi qu'après mai 68, en France, c'était après la dissolution, c'était une chambre qui était conservatrice. Donc si vous voulez, c'est une remarque que je partage avec vous, la différence entre le peuple qui détruit et le peuple qui construit. Ça, c'était ma première remarque. La deuxième remarque, c'est sur cette difficulté à allier la charia et la modernité, l'islam et, si vous voulez, le rationalisme. Alors, si vous voulez, bon, je partage avec vous mon point de vue, le problème, c'est pas de concilier l'islam avec la modernité. C'est de se poser la question pourquoi l'islam est interprété uniquement d'une certaine manière. C'est-à-dire que si on prend l'islam avec ses fondements qui sont basés sur la fraternité, la solidarité, le partage, l'appui aux démunis, mais l'islam n'est pas incompatible avec la modernité. Mais la première des choses que font les révolutions et les révolutionnaires dans le printemps arabe, c'est de dire par exemple, on veut retourner à la polygamie. Alors ce qui pose la question, c'est que le recours à l'islam dans les sociétés des relations sexuelles hors mariage. Je donne l'exemple qui est alarmant d'un État comme le Maroc qui a fait en 2005 une petite révolution sur le code de la famille, mais où pourtant une mineure violée peut épouser son violeur, et ça empêche le violeur d'être séquestré et d'être emprisonné. Alors pour résumer ce que je viens de dire, en fait le monde arabe, s'il n'a pas compris qu'il faut d'abord libérer la plus petite cellule sociale de la société, qui est la famille, la plus grande cellule qui est la société civile, ne fera même pas un pas. Merci.
We thank you very much, Professor Bernoussi. She has expanded, of course, now the factors that we have to take into consideration. We will return to those things. We have to, if we are going to write a constitution that will indeed be resonant in these countries. But unless the main speakers have anything to respond to, Professor Bernoussi, and then we will
I
have
was
to wrap up.
specifically asked the question, I think.
Yes, yes, yes.
In all my studies, the most difficult problem I have encountered with regarding modernity in Islam is the gender problem. So you are absolutely right. I have a very radical feminist sister myself, so it is in my family. And she almost excommunicated me from my own family. So I know everything, but I know your point. I agree with it. That is a huge problem. What makes it so difficult to solve is because there are some specific verses in the Quran which cannot be changed. If it was only with if these things were limited to the ahadith, only we could have reinterpreted them. But the Quran is very, very difficult to change. So, on the other hand, so I avoid that topic. That's the only thing I can do. On the other hand, when we are talking about nafs, protection of the individual, I think that gives me hope in the sense that when we are talking about protection of the individual, we are not talking about the gender problem. I mean, all individuals must be protected by the state. So that means, to me, that the basic rights of women also must be protected. This is all I can say. I am not an expert on gender issues, really. I avoid it like plague as far as I'm concerned. I really don't have any problem. I don't have a solution for that problem.
Okay, we thank all the speakers and the audience. So we'll have a lunch break now and Friday prayers break, and then we return by 2 o'clock, right? 2 o'clock. Thank you.
It's 2:30. It's not 2 o'clock. 2:30.
2:30. All right, correction.
I wanted to